Dear learners, welcome back to WSE English Story, where learning English becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, we will journey into the life of a man whose name you may know, but whose story is often hidden behind the walls of hospitals and classrooms. His name is Johns Hopkins, and the institution that carries his name changed the world of medicine forever. This is not simply the story of one man, or even one school. It is the story of a revolution in science and compassion, a vision that dared to believe knowledge and healing could be united for the good of all humanity. Johns Hopkins University and Hospital became the birthplace of discoveries that still save lives today, and their legacy continues to inspire hope across the globe. As you listen, you will not only improve your English but also walk alongside a story of courage, sacrifice, and a dream larger than life. Imagine the courage it took to dedicate one's fortune to a future he would never see, trusting that education and medicine would one day serve every child, every patient, every seeker of knowledge. Support our work by liking, commenting, or sharing this story with others. It truly helps us continue creating meaningful content for learners around the world. Get ready for the inspiring journey of Johns Hopkins, the man, the vision, and the medical revolution that changed the world. Let's begin. In the year 1795, on a quiet farm in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, a child was born into a Quaker family. His name was Johns Hopkins, unusual even in his own time, yet destined to be remembered by generations to come. The Quakers, or the Religious Society of Friends, believed in simplicity, honesty, and above all, equality. These values would shape young Johns in ways neither he nor his family could have imagined. The America of his childhood was a nation still in its infancy, not yet 50 years old. The Revolutionary War had ended only a few years before his birth. The young republic was alive with hope, yet also burdened with contradictions. Liberty was celebrated in words, but slavery remained an accepted reality in daily life. In this environment of new beginnings and deep struggles, Johns Hopkins began to form his own understanding of justice and human worth. His parents, Samuel and Hannah Hopkins, were devout Quakers. They taught their children to work hard, live with integrity, and serve others. On the family farm, Johns learned discipline and resilience, tending to the land and animals from an early age. But when he was just 12 years old, the Hopkins household faced a moment of crisis. The Quakers, following their conscience, chose to free the family's enslaved workers. This decision was morally just, but it carried heavy consequences. Without that labor, the family farm could no longer sustain itself as before. For young Johns, this moment was a lesson written not in books but in real life, that doing what is right often comes with sacrifice. It was a lesson that would remain with him throughout his life. Soon after, Johns was pulled from formal schooling to help keep the family afloat. His dreams of extended education were interrupted, replaced by long days of labor in the fields. Yet this setback did not extinguish his curiosity. Instead, it planted in him a fierce independence, a desire to carve his own path, and a respect for those who endured hardship for a greater good. Maryland, at that time, was a place of contradictions itself, a border state between North and South, with Baltimore rising as a bustling port city of trade and opportunity. The growing city called to ambitious young men, and Johns Hopkins, with his sharp mind and restless spirit, would one day leave the farm behind to seek his fortune there. But before he could change the world, he first had to face the challenges of youth, shaped by both the simplicity of Quaker life and the harsh realities of a society in transformation. When Johns Hopkins entered his teenage years, the world around him seemed larger and more demanding than the small farm where he had grown up. the early loss of his education weighed heavily on him. While other boys his age spent time with books and teachers, John spent his days in the fields, plowing the soil, tending animals, and carrying the burdens of adult responsibility far too soon. Yet inside, he carried a hunger that farm work could not satisfy. He longed to read, to understand the wider world, to follow the restless curiosity that burned within him. At night, after the day's labor, he often read by candlelight, studying whatever material he could find. Friends and family remembered him as quiet but determined, with eyes that seemed to see beyond the horizon of his present life. But the greatest challenge of his youth was not only the loss of schooling, it was the tension between his Quaker principles and the realities of the society he lived in. Maryland, divided between the culture of the North and South, was a place where the ideals of freedom clashed with the daily presence of slavery. John's own family had made the bold and difficult choice to free their enslaved workers. This decision left them poorer, but richer in conscience. Young Johns absorbed the message clearly: money and comfort may vanish, but the values of justice and integrity remain. Still, survival required practical choices. With the farm struggling, Johns's parents encouraged him to take his energy and ambition elsewhere. At the age of 17, he left the family farm to work in Baltimore with his uncle's wholesale grocery business. Baltimore was unlike anything he had known before. It was noisy, crowded, full of ships, merchants, sailors, and people from every walk of life. For a boy who had grown up in the quiet rhythms of Quaker life, it was overwhelming, yet also thrilling. But soon, even here, challenge found him. His Quaker upbringing forbade alcohol, and yet in his uncle's business, liquor was a profitable product. When Johns refused to sell it, sticking firmly to his principles, his uncle dismissed him. Once again, Johns was faced with sacrifice: should he abandon his values to earn success, or hold to his conscience and risk failure? He chose the latter. This decision left him unemployed in a city that demanded strength, wit, and resilience to survive. For many young men, it might have meant the end of ambition, a forced return to the farm. But for Johns Hopkins, it was the beginning of a lifelong journey of independence. He struck out on his own, determined to succeed without compromise. The question arose: how could a young man with little formal education, no wealthy connections, and no steady employment carve a path in a competitive, unforgiving city? This was the emerging problem that Johns Hopkins faced: not simply how to make a living, but how to build a life of meaning, one rooted in principles yet able to thrive in a changing world. The answer would come only through struggle, patience, and bold choices. Baltimore in the early 1800s was a city of energy and opportunity, but also of risk and uncertainty. Ships came and went from its busy harbor, carrying goods across the Atlantic, and the streets were alive with traders, craftsmen, and immigrants searching for a better life. Into this restless world stepped young Johns Hopkins, a determined teenager who had just lost his position at his uncle's grocery business. Without money, without a university education, and without family connections to protect him, he faced the city on his own. The first years were not easy. Hopkins found small jobs, saving every penny he could. He was frugal, almost to the point of austerity. His Quaker upbringing had taught him to avoid unnecessary luxury, and this became a strength. While others spent their wages on drink or leisure, Johns saved, invested, and thought always of the future. His room was simple, his clothes plain, but his vision was ambitious. He began working in trade and finance, entering partnerships, and slowly gaining experience. Baltimore's economy was growing, and Hopkins proved to have a natural instinct for business. He observed carefully, learned quickly, and most importantly, built a reputation for honesty. In a city where many sought quick wealth, his word became his bond. Merchants trusted him, and slowly doors opened. Yet the path forward was still uncertain. Hopkins had no mentor guiding him, no powerful sponsors smoothing the way. Every decision carried weight, and every mistake could ruin him. There were nights when the young businessman must have lain awake, wondering whether he had chosen too difficult a road. But inside him was a quiet fire. He refused to bend his principles, even when it slowed his rise. And with each challenge overcome, his confidence grew stronger. The 1820s and 1830s brought him success as a merchant and investor. Hopkins entered the world of banking, where his careful calculations and bold yet steady hand won respect. He lent money when others hesitated, trusted his judgment when others doubted, and slowly built a fortune. Yet money itself was never his only goal. What fascinated him was what money could do, how it could shape cities, industries, and eventually, the lives of countless people. Still, Johns Hopkins remained unmarried and childless. Some say he had once loved, but that family obligations and personal duty had kept him from marriage. Whatever the reason, he poured his energy into work and into the idea that his wealth must one day serve a greater purpose. He often spoke of education, of health, of lifting people from poverty and illness. His own interrupted schooling and his family's sacrifice to free enslaved workers had planted in him a conviction: true success was not measured in gold, but in service to humanity. And yet, that conviction was not yet ready to bloom. For now, he was still a man in motion, building, striving, facing the risks of business in a turbulent century. Baltimore was struck by epidemics, by economic crises, by political unrest, and Hopkins weathered them all. Each time, he emerged not only intact but stronger, more disciplined, more convinced that fortune must be used wisely. The journey of his early struggles was shaping him into a man unlike most of his peers. Where others saw only profit, he saw possibility. Where others thought only of family inheritance, he dreamed of leaving behind a legacy far greater than himself. But destiny has a way of testing visionaries. Just when Johns Hopkins was establishing himself as one of the wealthiest men in Baltimore, a new challenge would rise, one not of money, but of mortality. Disease and human suffering, spreading like shadows over the city, would soon confront him with the turning point of his life. By the mid-19th century, Johns Hopkins had become one of the wealthiest men in Baltimore. His investments in banking, the railroad, and mercantile trade had paid off, and his reputation for honesty and discipline made him one of the city's most respected citizens. Yet even as his fortune grew, so did the shadows of a problem that no amount of money could solve: the devastating toll of disease. Baltimore, like many American cities of the era, was vulnerable to epidemics. Yellow fever, cholera, and smallpox swept through the crowded streets, leaving families shattered and neighborhoods in mourning. Medical knowledge was limited. Hospitals, when they existed, were often places of fear rather than healing. The poor had almost no access to proper care. For Johns Hopkins, who walked these streets and saw both the prosperity of trade and the misery of illness, a question began to burn in his mind: what was the true purpose of his fortune, if not to relieve this suffering? One particular outbreak of cholera left a lasting mark on him. Families were torn apart, and even the wealthy could not buy safety when death spread silently. Hopkins had seen financial storms, but this was different. Disease respected no boundaries, no class, no amount of money. In the face of such suffering, he realized that wealth alone meant little unless it was transformed into hope for others. It was in this period of reflection that Hopkins began to shape a vision that would forever change medicine. He thought not of a single hospital, but of a system, an institution where research, teaching, and healing would stand side by side. He dreamed of a place where the poor could receive the same care as the rich, where doctors and students would work together, where knowledge would advance not in isolation but in service to humanity. This was radical thinking for the time. Most hospitals were little more than places to house the sick, with minimal medical knowledge and no real focus on discovery. The idea of combining a hospital with a university was nearly unheard of. Yet Hopkins understood that the future required boldness. He believed that education and medicine were inseparable, one trained the mind, the other healed the body, and both must grow together. At the same time, Hopkins was also deeply influenced by his Quaker roots. His faith taught him that every person carried an inner light, a spark of divine worth. This conviction made him insist that the hospital and university he envisioned would be open to all, regardless of wealth, background, or status. And so, he made a decision that would define his legacy. In 1873, just before his death, Johns Hopkins left instructions in his will that his vast fortune, amounting to $7 million, an unimaginable sum at the time, would be used to create both a university and a hospital in Baltimore. His bequest was the largest in American history up to that moment. The news shook the nation. Never before had such a gift been made for the advancement of learning and health. $7 million was not just a donation, it was a revolution in philanthropy. People asked, why would one man, with no wife, no children, dedicate his fortune to strangers he would never meet? The answer lay in his life's journey: the boy forced to leave school too soon, the young man who refused to sell liquor against his conscience, the businessman who witnessed the suffering of disease, and the Quaker who believed in the equality of all souls. Johns Hopkins had reached his turning point. No longer was he simply a merchant of Baltimore. He had become something far greater, the architect of a vision that would outlive him, a vision of knowledge and healing united in the service of humanity. But as history shows, even the noblest dreams require sacrifice and struggle before they can be realized. The years after Hopkins's death would test whether his daring vision could truly take form. When Johns Hopkins passed away in 1873, his will left behind a vision so bold that many doubted it could ever be achieved. A university and a hospital, side by side, rising from Baltimore's soil to serve all people, this was a dream ahead of its time. But between vision and reality lay a vast gulf, filled with challenges that threatened to undo the legacy he had entrusted to the future. The executors of his will, along with the trustees, faced the monumental task of turning Hopkins's words into stone, brick, and living institutions. Critics were quick to pounce. $7 million was a great fortune, but would it be enough to build both a university and a hospital of the scale he imagined? Some argued it was folly to attempt both. They suggested the money should be divided, spent more modestly. Others feared that combining research and patient care would create chaos instead of progress. The conflict grew sharper when the trustees debated the purpose of the university itself. At the time, American higher education was largely modeled on colleges that focused on teaching classical subjects, with little emphasis on research. Hopkins's will called for something different, a university that would advance knowledge, that would train minds to push into the unknown, that would stand as America's answer to Europe's great research institutions. It was a radical idea, and not everyone agreed. Could a new university, built in a port city with no long academic tradition, really rise to challenge the likes of Oxford or Heidelberg? Meanwhile, the vision for the hospital faced equally daunting obstacles. Hospitals in the 19th century often carried a reputation of despair. For the poor, they were last resorts; for the wealthy, places to avoid. To imagine a hospital that combined care for the sick with teaching for medical students, and research for new discoveries, seemed too ambitious. Even some physicians scoffed. They questioned whether such a plan could ever function in practice. But here lay the true sacrifice of Johns Hopkins. He had chosen not to spend his wealth on comfort or personal legacy, but to entrust it entirely to the hands of others, to a future he would never see. It was an act of faith, of courage, of self-denial. He would not be there to defend his vision, to correct mistakes, or to silence critics. He gave away not only his money, but control over what it would become. For the trustees and the early leaders of the institutions, every decision felt like walking a tightrope. Should they spend more on immediate buildings, or save for long-term sustainability? Should the hospital be grand in design, or humble in form but bold in purpose? The debates were fierce, the risks enormous. One figure, Daniel Coit Gilman, emerged as the pivotal choice for the university's first president. Appointed in 1875, Gilman embodied the daring spirit Hopkins had hoped for. He believed that the university must not only teach knowledge but create it, that its laboratories and lecture halls must become engines of discovery. Choosing Gilman was itself a sacrifice, for it meant breaking from tradition, rejecting the safe path of imitation, and venturing into the unknown. The climax of this struggle came as construction began, funds were stretched, and critics circled. The trustees could have retreated, scaled down the vision, and turned Hopkins's dream into a modest college and hospital. But they did not. They chose to risk it all, to follow the boldness of the man who had trusted them with his life's work. In that choice, sacrifice and vision intertwined. The trustees gave up the comfort of safety. They embraced uncertainty. They endured criticism. And in so doing, they preserved the purity of Hopkins's dream. It is often said that greatness is not achieved without sacrifice. For Johns Hopkins, the sacrifice was personal wealth and the security of control. For his successors, the sacrifice was the courage to risk failure in pursuit of something transformative. Together, these sacrifices carried the vision across the dangerous waters of doubt, and set it on the course to become one of the greatest institutions in history. But what came next was not merely survival, it was triumph. Out of conflict and choice, the university and hospital began to rise, carrying with them discoveries that would forever alter the course of medicine and science. In 1876, 3 years after Johns Hopkins's death, the university that bore his name opened its doors. It was the beginning of something America had never seen before. Under the leadership of President Daniel Coit Gilman, Johns Hopkins University declared its mission, not simply to transmit old knowledge, but to create new knowledge. This was a bold departure from the traditions of most American colleges. From the very first lectures, students sensed they were part of something revolutionary. Gilman recruited brilliant minds, both from the United States and from Europe, bringing professors who were researchers as much as teachers. Laboratories, not just lecture halls, became the heart of the campus. The PhD degree, long a European custom, was introduced in America through Johns Hopkins University, setting a standard that would soon spread across the nation. The university quickly attracted talent. Young scholars came to Baltimore, eager to work in this new environment of discovery. Soon, Johns Hopkins was producing groundbreaking research in fields from mathematics to chemistry, physics to history. The ripple effect was enormous. Within a few decades, universities across America were reshaped by the model Hopkins had pioneered. And then, in 1889, the second half of Hopkins's vision came alive. The Johns Hopkins Hospital opened its doors. It was unlike any hospital in the nation. Modern in design, it combined patient care, medical education, and research under one roof. Here, students learned not only from books, but at the bedside, guided by physicians who were themselves pioneering new methods. The hospital became a place of firsts. The first medical residency program, now a standard worldwide, was established here. The famous Oslerian method, introduced by Dr. William Osler, emphasized close observation of patients and learning through direct care. Surgeons like William Halsted developed techniques that would set the foundation for modern surgery. And Dr. Howard Kelly, a founder of gynecology, advanced women's health in ways previously unimaginable. What made Hopkins unique was not only its doctors, but its spirit. Here, research was not separate from healing, it was a tool to improve it. Patients, whether rich or poor, could benefit from the very latest discoveries. Knowledge was shared, not hidden. Healing was approached with science, but also with dignity. The university and hospital grew together, like two branches of the same tree, each nourishing the other. By the turn of the 20th century, Johns Hopkins had become a world leader in medicine, a beacon that drew scholars and patients from across the globe. The discoveries made in its halls and wards saved lives not only in Baltimore, but in countless towns and cities far beyond. And the achievements did not stop there. Hopkins became the model for research universities across America. The PhD system, the emphasis on graduate research, the union of teaching and discovery, these spread from Baltimore to Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and beyond. The Johns Hopkins model redefined what higher education in America could be. The triumph was not only academic or medical. It was deeply human. Hopkins's vision had taken the wealth of one man and transformed it into knowledge for millions, healing for the suffering, and opportunity for those who hungered to learn. Looking back, one cannot help but ask, how many lives have been saved because Johns Hopkins chose to invest in the future? How many discoveries were made because one man refused to spend his fortune on himself, but gave it away for the world? The answer stretches far beyond numbers. It is measured in generations of doctors, in patients who found hope, in families who walked out of the hospital with their loved ones healed. It is measured in the confidence of students who dared to question, experiment, and discover, because a university once taught them that learning was not about repeating the past, but about shaping the future. Johns Hopkins had achieved victory, not in his lifetime, but in the legacy that carried forward his dream. When we look at the name Johns Hopkins today, it is easy to think only of a university ranked among the best in the world, or a hospital famous for its breakthroughs in medicine. But behind the name lies a deeper story, a story of vision, sacrifice, and the belief that knowledge and healing belong to everyone. Hopkins himself did not live to see the university or the hospital open their doors. He never walked the lecture halls or stood at the bedside of patients in the institution he dreamed of. And yet, his presence is felt in every corner of those campuses. His vision was so clear, his gift so bold, that even generations later, it continues to guide and inspire. The lessons are powerful. First, that education and health are not luxuries for the few, but rights for all. Hopkins, shaped by his Quaker belief in equality, insisted that his fortune serve both the mind and the body, the rich and the poor alike. Second, that courage often means giving without knowing the outcome. He entrusted his wealth to the future, never certain whether it would succeed. That leap of faith has saved millions of lives. There is also a lesson in resilience. Hopkins was not born into privilege. He lost his schooling young, worked through hardship, faced criticism, and lived with personal loneliness. Yet instead of bitterness, he chose purpose. He transformed personal loss into public hope. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: true success is not what we keep for ourselves, but what we give away. Hopkins could have lived a life of luxury, remembered as just another wealthy merchant of Baltimore. Instead, he chose a legacy of service. Today, when the world speaks the name Johns Hopkins, it speaks not of a man's fortune, but of healing, discovery, and education that continues to change lives across the globe. So we might ask ourselves, in our own lives, what legacy are we building? What values will endure when our days are done? For Hopkins, the answer was clear: to give his wealth, his name, and his trust to the betterment of humanity. And in that choice, he became immortal. The story of Johns Hopkins reminds us that even in a world full of division and suffering, one person's vision can create ripples that travel through centuries. Knowledge, compassion, and courage, these were the pillars of his dream, and they remain pillars we can hold onto today. And so, the story of Johns Hopkins comes to an end, not as the tale of a single man, but as a living legacy that continues to shape our world today. From a boy who left school at 12, to a businessman who turned hardship into fortune, to a visionary who gave it all away for the sake of others, his life reminds us that greatness is not measured by wealth, but by what we choose to do with it. Today, the name Johns Hopkins is spoken not because of what he owned, but because of what he gave. Millions of patients have been healed in the hospital that bears his name. Generations of students have learned, discovered, and carried knowledge forward through the university he imagined. Countless lives, people he never knew and would never meet, have been touched because of a decision he made more than a century ago. As we reflect on his journey, let us carry its lesson into our own lives, that true success lies not in power or possessions, but in leaving behind something that uplifts others. Whether in small acts of kindness or bold visions for the future, each of us has the power to shape a legacy that outlives us. So, when you hear the name Johns Hopkins, may it remind you that one person, guided by conviction and compassion, can change the course of history. Thank you for joining this journey. Until next time, may you be inspired to learn, to serve, and to dream of a future that gives more than it takes.